Not again, not again, not again. In the short 2019 film by Daniel and Clara, Snakes and Ladders, Laura Mulvey says, "I think the mantra at the time was a radical aesthetics for a radical politics. And that long-standing position, going back to the Soviet Union and so on, was, in a sense, intensified by the feminist aesthetic, which demanded that the image be politicized, and demanded that the relationship between the signifier and the signified be split, so that, in a sense, that feminist position reinforced the avant-garde splitting of meaning, splitting of signification, questioning representation, questioning what the image referred to, and so on." In her now famous essay, Visual Pleasures and Narrative Cinema, published in 1975 in Screen, Volume 16, Laura Mulvey deployed the psychoanalytic writings of Sigmund Freud and Jacques Lacan to develop a feminist theory of spectatorship within narrative Hollywood cinema. Drawing upon examples from the films of Alfred Hitchcock and Joseph von Sternberg, Mulvey developed a highly influential account of the male gaze, whilst attempting to use the essay to disrupt and destroy the scopophilic pleasures of narrative fiction film. Throughout her work, Mulvey has woven together feminist and psychoanalytic analysis, avant-garde aesthetics, techniques, and radical politics to disrupt the image. Her books, The Visual and Other Pleasures, 1989, Death, 24 Times a Second, Stillness and the Moving Image, 2005, After Images, On Cinema, Women and Changing Times, 2019, have continued this exploration of cinematic image, whilst her films, Penthesilea, Queen of the Amazon, 1975 with Peter Wallen, Riddles of the Sphinx, 1977 with Peter Wallen, Frida Kahlo and Tina Medotti, 1983 with Peter Wallen, and Disgraced Monuments, 1991 with Mark Lewis, developed the essay as film form whilst exploring avant-garde themes and deploying avant-garde techniques. In this session, we will be joined by Laura Mulvey to discuss her work, themes relating to it, and the politics of filmmaking for the future. The session was recorded on the 28th of July 2020 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group, which meets fortnightly to discuss a range of issues relating to avant-garde art, counterculture, and radical culture. The sessions are free and open to all, so if you'd like to get involved, send us a message at explodingappendix@gmail.com. And if you like this and you want to find out more about what we do, check out our website at www.explodingappendix.com. I think that's all I've got to say, so over to the discussion with Laura. Yeah, so in both your films and your essays since the 1970s, you've been interested in kind of developing a kind of feminist formalism, so a kind of experimentation with artistic form of work around feminist issues, especially in relation to film. To what extent has your understanding of this feminist formalism developed over the years?
Well, I think probably not at all. To my mind, there's a way in which certain moments of history make it possible to think certain kinds of thoughts and engage with certain kinds of radical aesthetics. I mean, seeing that what you're interested in, what your group is interested in, is the relationship between radical aesthetics and radical politics, as I understand it.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly one of my main interests. Yeah.
Yes, and I mean, as I've done an extensive interview with Daniel and Clara, and of course I can't remember what I said. I might well be repeating myself, and no doubt all I can do is come up with the same kinds of things as I've said many times before. But that I think there are various overdeterminate factors in that 1970s moment. For one thing, I mean, I'm not saying these things necessarily in a specific order, but just enumerating a couple of factors. One was that in the 1960s and then leading into the 1970s, there was a revived interest in the concept of the avant-garde and radical politics and radical aesthetics. So that involved looking back, researching, thinking about what was then called the historical avant-garde of the 1920s, and so on, with the specific interest probably in the Soviet avant-garde, French avant-garde of the 1920s. So that was a historical strand. But I think probably more relevant and more important from the point of view of the contribution made by the women's movement, the question of representation came to be articulated as a political issue, very much, I think, for the first time. Feminism came up with the idea that images and representation were a site of struggle and a site of political struggle. And I think in that sense, that was one of the most innovative aspects of the theoretical side of feminism at that particular time. So here, and I've said this often before, but I'll just try and sketch it in. So here you see a move from the women's movement arguing that the female body was a site of struggle, that the body is a site of oppression in various different kinds of ways, to do with violence, to do with sexuality, to do with reproductive rights. And then the step from that to thinking about images of the body as a political issue is, in the first instance, quite straightforward. The body is a site of struggle, images of the body are a site of struggle. But as soon as the question moves on to one of images and representation, the question of meaning arises. So what do these images mean? What do they refer to? What are they, what does an image of a woman circulating within patriarchal society, constructed out of the patriarchal psyche, what does it actually represent? Does it represent women, or does it represent a patriarchal, more fetishistic concept of what woman means within patriarchal society? So there's the question of the gap between what an image seems to represent and what it might actually represent. And that takes a kind of theoretical step, a moment of deciphering and thinking theoretically. For me, that personally was a very exciting and interesting moment to take that step, because it then raised questions about how meaning circulates under patriarchy. So representation as a political issue. So as soon as you think about what kinds of representation this is, it then makes you begin to ask theoretical questions and begin to question how meanings circulate and how meanings can then be challenged. I think that it's also very important to realize that in terms of my work, my collaboration with Peter Wallen and so on, that there was a much wider context. And so when we talk about the avant-garde at the time, we have to think about a movement which brought together filmmakers, curators, festival organizers, writers, researchers, people who edited journals, and so on. So that the whole interest in these questions of the avant-garde covered a wide swathe of different kinds of cultural forms.
Well, yeah, because you were doing like exhibitions as well. It wasn't just essays that you were writing. You were making films, you're doing exhibitions, you're doing a lot of different things.
I'm so sorry. I haven't really got a cough. I just cough.
This is how meaning is created.
So I just wanted at this early moment to bring in a quotation from Victor Shklovsky, which also illustrates the way in which in the 1970s we were looking back to the thinkers of the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And I think it's a quotation that I go back to often and which seems to say something to me. So I'd like to see if it said something to any of you as well. Art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object is not important. So this really takes one back to the way of making things unfamiliar, distantiating the relationship of the spectator to what the spectator is seeing, and, and making that kind of stony, the object weighty, not in itself, but the mode of perception becomes materialized and conscious. So it's a way of shifting out of habit into this kind of unfamiliarity. Iona, were you going to say something?
Oh, nothing. I was just going to say, is it quite influenced by Brecht, this unfamiliarity?
I think that's a really good point. I think they were both thinking along the same lines, probably simultaneously. And that's very much the kind of defamiliarization that the avant-garde of that period across Germany and the Soviet Union would have shared. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
So, Laura, who is this quote by?
Victor Shklovsky.
It's amazing that you've read that. I feel like we've been trying to write something like that in the past few weeks about what we're trying to do in our work.
I go back to that little quotation all the time. It comes from an essay he wrote called Artist Technique, which you can find very easily on the internet.
It's because it seems to be about becoming conscious of how we experience, and maybe conscious of things that we experience and information or things that are given to us that maybe we wouldn't be conscious of. That's kind of a but that we would maybe unconsciously receive, and becoming conscious of those mechanisms.
It's trying to take habit out of perception.
Yes.
So it's how and in the essay Artist Technique, he doesn't just talk in this theoretical way. He talks about also how he tries to relate to the objects in his flat or his house or something like that. How one unfamiliarizes everyday life, as it were.
Yeah, I really like this thing about prolonging the process of perception as well, and fragmenting almost to, as a technique of disruption to draw attention. Perception
must be prolonged. And I also wanted to bring that in early on because it kind of fits in with the films that Peter and I made in the 1970s. That sense of almost excessive duration and excessive extension of prolongation of time, so that the cinema itself, one hopes, becomes slightly defamiliarized.
Do you think that the meaning of your films has changed over time? Do you think that the way that people are reading them is different from when you began showing them, or even how you read them?
Gosh, I think people are more tolerant nowadays. I think people are more prepared. Strangely enough, although nowadays people are always talking about lack of people's lack of concentration and so on. But actually, I think there's a different relationship to the moving image, so that actually people are used nowadays to experiencing the moving image in different kinds of ways. It's not just going into the cinema and expecting to be entertained, as it was in the old days.
Interesting.
I suppose there's also there's a context that the work comes with that people are aware of. So they know that it was made in a certain era, and that was, you know, and often when I think films like yours and other films that are sort of avant-garde and experimental films of a certain period, they often come with a kind of program notes or an introduction or something that kind of almost gives you some kind of historical context and clues and things. So I think maybe that prepares people in a different way for something, whereas if it was something new now, it would be maybe received differently.
True. Yeah.
I did want to add something, perhaps, as a follow-up to what you said, that we don't go to the theater merely to be entertained, at least these days. But it seems to me that while there has been a politicization of cinema, a politicization of watching, at the same time, it seems that there's been a parallel movement, or perhaps it's just me, where we've embraced the dimension of watching as a pleasure in itself, of visual pleasure as just a pleasure in its own right. I'm very tempted to use the word jouissance here. That
So
we've kind of.
Sorry, I was just interrupting. Can you give us a more substantial example of what you're thinking of, what you have in mind?
I honestly struggle to, but I kind of sense a change in the atmosphere, a change in the air, as it were, that it seems that we've become conscious of the dimension of enjoyment in doing things, right? And that would include the activity of watching a film, and that the watching in itself is a certain modality of pleasure, a modality of jouissance. And it seems that film itself has become somehow aware of this, and it seems to me that film today definitely exploits this consciousness of its own jouissance, of its own kind of scopic pleasures.
Example?
Can I give you an example? I'm thinking of, no, it's hard for me to give an example, because even films from decades ago would be watched in this new way, as it were, with this present historical consciousness and mode of consuming the art object. But I could be completely wrong here, and if you feel there hasn't been that kind of historical shift, then perhaps I'm mistaken.
I mean, we could ask Celeste, because there's Celeste. I'm not that familiar with the great Philippine experimental filmmakers that you've had recently. Do you know who I mean? I can't remember the names.
What are their films?
Great epics about Philippine history, very long.
Is this Kidlat Tahimik?
Oh, not Kidlat. No, I know Kidlat's work. Yeah. This is someone more recent.
Love Diaz, the long films.
Got it. Yeah. And have you seen his films?
Yes, I've seen Babaeng Humayo.
And what did you make of them? I mean, I'm saying this, Johan, I'm saying this because I think these films, as I understand them, demand a very different kind of cinematic experience and perception. Something that's probably never been demanded before. Celeste, what do you think?
Yeah, usually Love Diaz's films would be longer than the usual 1.5 to 2 hours film. It would span to 3 to 7 hours, and you would prepare yourself to to sit down through it, even though sometimes there would be an intermission in the middle of the film. So I think a part of the experience is preparing yourself.
Very interesting.
Yeah, so aside from knowing that they're long, the way he shoots his scenes are actually very long as well. He would usually just have one long shot, and it would take a whole while till the next scene. So it's also very meditative. It's very patient.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think,
and also, if I can just ask another question, very involved with landscape and landscape as history, the landscape of the country.
Yeah. He would take shots of those, and I think that's it. Preparing yourself for the long film.
From the description, it sounds a little bit like I may be pronouncing the filmmaker's name wrong, but Bela Tarr, who did Satantago, I believe his name. It seems quite similar from at least from the descriptions. Very, very long shots of landscape, 7-hour Odyssey kind of thing. Is there a comparison there, just from verbal description?
Yeah, I think so, and also the sense that history is inscribed. It's not just told or recounted. History is inscribed in our landscape. Well, this might come back to Daniel and Clara's project, actually, how you find the remains of history in in the landscape, and how cinema, film, being itself a medium which can actually respond to traces and remnants and etc., etc. You see what I mean? Cinema actually has a particular, perhaps, to come back to Iona, a kind of particular sensibility in relation to this kind of history.
Yeah, and that sounds very like the Annales, their sort of ethos, right, of for history, where you're saying finding history in the landscape. That's like that. They find history everywhere. They find it in sort of all kinds of things. Fashion.
But I suppose that would lead on to who did the Places of Memory, Lieu de Mémoire.
Is that it from the Annales?
Perhaps he's later.
There's Duby, the second Annales school. There's Duby and Le Goff memoir. I think I have heard of that, but I see right.
Oh, I know what he's called. He's called Nora, Philippe Nora.
I don't know him.
And it's called Places of Memory, and he's particularly interested in how particular places gather memory into themselves and become these particular rather, I mean, I don't want to sound too pretentious and say kind of sacred sites, but kind of rather particular sites where memory and experience is invested in some mythic way.
Obviously, like there's a way of kind of rendering history in terms of just showing kind of it seems to me in a realist way of showing landscapes, of showing historical sites, and I'm kind of halfway through a Tarkovsky film called Andrei Rublev at the moment, and it's very even though it has this kind of surrealistic undertone, everyone's still very much in costume, and there's kind of an effort to render a kind of a historically believable kind of site. But then I think of it like kind of other instances, perhaps more abstract and experimental instances of trying to render perhaps personal history, like a film I watched recently called The Color of Pomegranates. I can't remember who the director was, but that's the one. Yeah.
Who was saying it? Someone's
Parajanov, I believe.
Parajanov, yeah.
And there's a complete different approach taken where everything's so symbolic, and yet there's still like this kind of very graspable historical aspect to it where you do feel kind of transported. So it seems like, I mean, I don't want to like create a dualism or anything like that, but there does seem to be two very radically different approaches to rendering a history of a place and or people.
Interestingly, Parajanov and Tarkovsky were friends, and I think influenced each other quite a lot.
Oh, I didn't know.
Even though their work is on a surface different, I think they had a lot of interests in common.
I wouldn't say it was so different. I feel like, in a way, they're both symbolists. They both are thinking of cinema as poetry more than attempting to kind of create a representation of reality. Maybe that then I feel like what you're getting more is a kind of expression of a spiritual experience of reality, but not an attempt to create a sort of a realism. It's interesting that used that word with Tchaikovsky, because that's certainly not how I think.
Yeah, I mean, certainly with like Stalker and Solaris, I would never use that word, but it seems like Andrei Rublev seems his attempt at some sort of historical epic while still having a bit of the Tarkovsky kind of special sauce that makes those films what they are.
Even Andrei Rublev, there's these beautiful sort of transitions between time and dreams and vision, where it could almost be seen as the technique they uses is almost like a realist technique of, you all in one camera move, but then you realize that you're suddenly seeing into a vision, and that's not what that character would actually be seeing in that situation. And I think that's the power of cinema. That's what cinema can do.
But I think there's a difference between, I mean, I've seen Andrei Rublev, but so long ago I can't actually summon it up in my mind. But I mean, the film, so far as I remember, is trying to evoke this important historical period, rather than looking, as it were, now at how the traces of the past are left in the present, which is perhaps a slightly different thing. But perhaps we should carry. I think we're still on Bradley's first question.
Yes, we are.
This happens a lot. It's great.
So in your introduction to the second edition of Visual and Other Pleasures, you describe how psychoanalytic theory gave you a polemical vocabulary. So what interests me here is that psychoanalysis is seen not merely as a theoretical tool, but as a kind of polemical tool. Similar in a way to the sort of avant-garde devices that disrupt conventional artistic spectatorship. How do you understand the relationship between the psychoanalytic on the one hand and the polemical on the other?
Well, my generation of the women's liberation movement in the early 1970s we really picked up Freud, and we were quite criticized. I mean, in the end, in the appendix to my new book, After Images, I've got a section called Visual and Other Pleasures, Frequently Asked Questions, FAQs. And one of them is, how can you possibly be interested in or influenced by Freud, who is well known to be a misogynist? And that's the question that was often put to us. Now, what we found was precisely the point that you made, Bradley, that Freud offered us some kind of vocabulary and conceptual lexicon for thinking about things that we in the women's movement found ourselves really challenged by, which is, how does gender come into existence? This might be a bit more of interest to Celeste. How is gender constructed? How does patriarchal society make, as it were, the concept of femininity? And what we found was that Freud and Freudian concepts were of enormous interest and help in analyzing what you might call the patriarchal the patriarchal psyche, but actually had very little to say, and Freud recognized this himself, had very little to say about the female psyche. So in the first instance, what I was interested in particular, I mean, a number of my friends and other people in the women's movement at the time also used Freud in their work. But I was interested in, as it were, using Freud's concepts as a tool to decipher the, say, the way in which images of women circulated in patriarchal society. Why did images of women look the particular way they did? And actually, you found Freud explained an enormous amount, because his interest in masculinity was very much in its vulnerabilities. So he was interested in male fetishism, he was interested in the male castration complex, and the way in which the female body was a site of anxiety for the male unconscious. So in this sense, he was a kind of gold mine, and I found that I could combine my old long-standing interest in Hollywood films and just apply various Freudian concepts, and they fitted together, as it were. So, but I think the question then arises, I mean, Freud saw the feminine as an enigmatic, and he didn't feel that he had the resources to really understand the way that femininity was constructed. But at the same time, it left us with the question of what happens to femininity, and this was one of the ways in which I moved towards an interest in the maternal at the same time as my friend Mary Kelly started to be interested in the same thing in her artwork. And so where does this leave the mother in patriarchal society? And it leaves her very much in a world of silence, outside Johann, the symbolic order, if you see my Lacanian reference, stuck within the imaginary, outside the symbolic, and left with the task of introducing the child to the language of the patriarchy, to the culture of the symbolic, and staying herself behind much more in the realm of silence. So the question there was one of concentrating very much on how Freud and also how Lacan understood the place of the mother within the Oedipal trajectory and challenging it. Yes, so in a sense, trying to understand how one could read out of the absence of women in the symbolic order, their association with silence, and how the task, as it were, of the woman, whether it's the filmmaker, the poet, the novelist, whoever it is, to try and find what Peter once called to move from linguistic transparency to the stutter, the hieroglyph, and the riddle. And that again kind of relates back rather to the Shklovsky. So rather than language just being a simple matter of speech and communication, it begins to stutter and it begins to search for other modes of communication like the riddle and the decipherment, and moving, as it were, around, perhaps as Shklovsky himself would say, at a knight's move. So, in a sense, just to sum up, the Freud was of great interest in allowing us to analyze masculinity within patriarchy as vulnerable and particularly subject to these particular neuroses generated by the anxiety-provoking female body, but also opening up these kinds of absences and enigmas surrounding the feminine. Does your interest in Lacan come in here at all?
It certainly does, to the extent that I understand what Lacan has to say about these things. I think, you know, the question of the woman is perhaps his most perplexing aspect, even though it's so central.
Yeah.
So I can't even claim to understand some of his some of what he says about that. So, yeah.
I think it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, Freud seems to be doing something that's almost seems like it's like a universal psyche. If that's there's something unchanging about the psyche that Freud seems to be describing, but whereas it seems like you're describing a certain social situation like patriarchy. So,
yeah.
So is that there's a shift in how we understand what Freud is actually saying, I suppose.
Yes, I think so. Yes. Though, I mean, it seems to me that it's possibly time to come back and think again about the problem of masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't really embarked on that.
Oh yeah, no. Just I was just wondering. So when you think of the you know, the role of women in this way, does politics and the sort of system, you know, the system, say that, well, any system but capitalism, come into that? Does it relate to politics? I mean, because I know Freud didn't relate, you know, the psyche that much to politics and to the social on a bigger scale. But I'm wondering if you brought that into your interests.
He did, to the extent that he, in his essay Civilization and Its Discontents, he tried to analyze religion, and tried to understand these questions of irrational belief and also war. But he's, I think we in the women's movement neglected that side of him, and we concentrated very much on the question of gender rather than his more widespread social engagement with society. And also, you know, he was very, you know, growing up in Vienna as a Jew, he was very conscious of the tradition of oppression that he and his family and community went through. And indeed, he had to escape in the late 30s.
Do you think then gender, when you discuss gender, it has a relationship to the political system, for example, capitalism?
Yes, I do. I mean, this is a little bit tricky, you know, because it relates to, I mean, it relates to the way in which, oh, thank you, Celeste. Love Diaz, that's right. It relates to the way in which women were normalized within capitalist society as consumers. And so you move on to a new and different kind of fetishism, the fetishism of the commodity. And so how woman as fetish kind of both shifts then into the consumption of commodities and into, as it were, the production of fashion, the production of images, a kind of, well, we might be able to move on to, perhaps this is the moment when we could move on to Vertigo.
Yes, because that was the...
which is what it's all about.
Yeah, so I'll read that question then. So in your Visual Pleasures and Narrative Cinema, written in the early 70s, you critically engage in the films of Alfred Hitchcock, developing a theory of voyeurism and the male gaze. In your book, in your most recent book, After Images on Cinema, Women and Changing Times, you return to Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, acknowledging a self-awareness that you, to quote, failed to notice at the time. So I sort of wonder to what extent the critiques of things like Hitchcock, but Hollywood more generally, are coming from within their work themselves, and to what extent there is a kind of self-awareness, and to what extent there is a kind of need to come from the outside and critique externally.
So the point about that I felt was self-reflexive in Vertigo is that Hitchcock is quite literally analyzing a male phobic fetishism, which can only desire a woman who's constructed in a particular kind of way of absolute perfection, with all surface and absolutely a kind of shield of surface perfection. And in the film, as you remember, the main character, Scotty, falls into an obsessive love of the woman who's actually constructed for him and who doesn't really exist. And then when he finds the woman who pretended to be her, Madeline, he then can only desire her when he's reconstructed her into that previous image of surface perfection. So in a sense, Hitchcock is actually examining this male psyche, which needs the woman to have, needs the woman, as it were, to be constructed as a kind of fetishistic object. Now, you could say that all movie stars were in many ways constructed as fetishistic object, but in this particular case, Hitchcock uses a kind of blonde veneer, an exquisite mask of the cosmetic and fashion to create an image of woman which is not really of the feminine. It's, as it were, of a fantasy. And I was interested in the way in which he kind of coalesces this idea of the woman as perfect object with almost an automaton, so that the idea of the fascination of the cinema machine, and particularly the cinema screen, kind of coalesces with this perfect, fascinating image of the fetishized woman. So this film is, in a sense, about that. It's not just doing it, it's actually analyzing it. And it was here that I had another quotation that I wanted to give you, but I haven't got it properly. I've only got it, sorry, in my notes. It's from Walter Benjamin, so another kind of great thinker of the 1920s, where he's talking about what he calls the sex appeal of the inorganic. And he says, fashion is the worship of commodity fetishism. Fashion couples the living body to the inorganic world. Fetishism that succumbs to the sex appeal of the inorganic is fashion's vital nerve. So here, I think this is a long way round to go back to Iona's point, the way in which one can kind of tie together what Benjamin calls the sex appeal of the inorganic. So this is the woman, as it were, devoid of flesh and blood, and most particularly of blood, of anything that might remind the vulnerable male psyche of the castrated female body, and covering it up with a surface veneer of the inorganic is the only way in which this psyche can succumb to the sex appeal of the inorganic. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it seemed to me that Hitchcock has actually touched on something of this in that film. It's the ordinary girl is unable to arouse him in any way at all. The ordinary girl has to do with, as it were, the ordinary body and the everydayness of woman. And it's only when she's kind of reconstructed into the sex appeal of the organic that he can once again desire her. So that was the idea. And so I hope that that ties in a little bit with the question of commodity fetishism and the desire to kind of construct the woman as this object, rather to take her out of, as it were, the everyday and the bodiliness of woman, and to turn her into the kind of automaton, as it were.
Yeah, so it's almost like Hitchcock is doing a kind of psychoanalysis, but through lens.
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
You evoked Benjamin there, and it made me think a little bit about his distinction between that cultic value and is it display value or something like that, or exhibition value?
Oh, really? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it seems to be, if I'm remembering it rightly, that kind of the cultic value of an object, something like the sort of artifacts that were imbued with some sort of religiosity or something sort of kind of abstract and ungraspable, whereas exhibition value and display value being something very much kind of more surface, more of the commodity in it. And it makes me think whether or not that reconstruction of the woman as an object like feeds into that idea of having a commodity to display, something out there that on your arm, arm candy, as the saying goes, or whether there's something in that as well with that kind of allusion to Benjamin.
Yes, I think so. But also, if I can make a jump here, it's also to do with suspension of disbelief. So the way in which, in the old days, at any rate, you went to the cinema in order to be entranced and fascinated, and you didn't want to have to, you wanted to suspend disbelief. You wanted the cinema's machine to be veiled, as it were, by the fascination of what was on the screen. So, in a sense, what had to be hidden and concealed was the process, say, of projection, which could be concealed by the beauty of the screen itself. So, in a sense, the clumsiness and the anxiety-provoking aspects of the female body are indeed precisely veiled by the perfection of the fashionable surface.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Does this tie in with sort of reproduction and the fact that women can have babies?
No, I think it's precisely to deny that.
To deny that, that's what I mean. That's what I mean. To deny that. That's what
So to deny that women bleed, to deny that the body actually exists.
So is there a parallel there between, you know, I kind of think of the image of the kind of the spluttering projector that halfway through a performance comes to a halt and everyone realizes that they're not transported into the realm of wherever. And there being a kind of a parallel there between this perfect, fashionable constructed object, and then suddenly there being this glimpse of the bodily, the sneeze or the cough or the I don't know, the whatever, which makes you realize that this isn't, you know, an artifact. This isn't a religious object. It's a person. Just as you realize that the projector's mechanical and not you know, some sort of kind of astral projection or something.
Yes, I mean, I think that's well, to my mind, that parallel works absolutely perfectly. The projector is, as it were, the disavowed of the cinema machine. It's what has to be completely repressed. And then, just as, was that you, Max?
Yes. Yeah.
Saying that. Precisely as you said, there's that kind of terrifying moment when something goes wrong and the projector suddenly becomes, makes itself felt. And that's as though, as it were, the disavowed body had kind of forced itself to the forefront. And the beauty of the screen, as it were, dissolves in the face of the actual materiality of the process. And I sometimes think, I mean, this might be pushing the parallels and the metaphors too far, but if you want to think, as it were, of the question not just of Freudian fetishism, but of the commodity fetishism that Marx was interested in, he was interested in the way that the commodity fetish had to also have a beautiful sheen, a veneer that would be desirable, and what had to be repressed was any sign of the worker's labor that had actually produced this.
Right. Yeah.
So the hand of the worker had to disappear, say, under the streamlined final product of the beautiful Mercedes or whatever, you know.
And is this the representation of women hiding their labour and their labour as producers of children?
Yes, I think that's probably true. But I was just going to say that I think that you could say, if this isn't too fanciful an analogy, that the projector is there as the repressed of the film machine, in the way that the working class laborer is repressed under commodity fetishism.
Right, and there's also, I suppose, the repression of like these idols of kind of female fashion. Like I think of the suicide of Marilyn Monroe, who was always this supposedly this kind of pristine and perfect, you know, kind of object of female beauty, who clearly struggled. And I mean, her suicide is something like the projector film burning up and leaving no trace behind, kind of thing.
Yes.
Not again pushing metaphors, but I do love to push metaphors, you know.
I think actually Marilyn Monroe is an interesting example to think about, because in some ways she had an image that was very iconic and that was repeated from film to film, you know, like the blonde hair and the way that her face kind of became an icon. But then when you actually watch the films, she is actually one of the few actresses in which you sense a personality coming forth, and that the roles are almost questioning as well the fact that women exist in a position, especially at the time where women existed in a position where they're living through their image, and you know, her characters are dealing with that, and herself as an actress had something more, a personality that was coming through beyond that. And it's interesting also that there was also, she kind of was a magnet for the biggest projection, and in a way that led possibly, you know, to the end that she had.
I think it's really interesting that that's mentioned, given that that's the chapter that follows on from your Psycho in After Images.
Oh, from Vertigo?
Oh yeah, but that's sorry, Vertigo. Yes.
Vertigo, I go on to Marilyn. Yes.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was really interesting that
Yeah.
came
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. But I think one of the things that's very interesting about her is that, again, a parallel, Max, a metaphor, that she kind of parallels the decline of Hollywood, the studio system. And although there were many other rebels and many other people who refused to conform to the studio system at the time, she becomes almost emblematic of that rebellion against 20th Century Fox. And that when she started her own company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, or whatever it was called, she had the problem. She had to still be the most famous movie star in the whole world, or her career would have come to an end. And her whole attempt to kind of remake herself wouldn't have worked. But she also had to do something different. And one of the things I think is very interesting in her later films, the ones that she produced herself, is that she's no longer the fetishized image that you see in the earlier movies. So if any of you have seen Niagara, she's completely brilliant in that, which is before she became stereotyped. But she actually begins to play in The Misfits and in, oh goodness, I can't remember what it's called, a couple of those movies that she produced herself. She plays the ordinary woman who wants to look like Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, it's The Misfits is a brilliant film.
Yeah, and so in that, she's playing all the masses and masses of ordinary women across white America who are dyeing their hair and trying to look like Marilyn.
That's an amazing way to deal with that problem.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But of course, she didn't live long enough really to explore it in great detail.
What I thought was interesting about that as well, if you see some of her earlier films before she kind of got to be a big A-lister, which I think was probably Niagara, but she does a lot of character acting. Yeah. She's a good character actress. She's not. I mean, after she became the big Marilyn, she's always kind of sort of a bit similar. I think that she's
stereotyped, and in the end, she couldn't stand it.
Yeah.
And that was when she rebelled, and she said, "Who's going to want to go on watching me if I'm the same thing in each picture?" But I think in Niagara, you see that she was a real character actress.
Yeah.
Was that the one you meant? Was that you, Iona?
Films that when she's not, before she was really a star, and she's done kind of like supporting roles. One, I think she's a kind of a killer in one of them. And I think she's pretty good at it. And there's another one.
Knock on any. It's called Knock on Any Door.
Don't bother to knock. Don't bother to knock. Yeah, that's right. And then another one. She's a secretary. Now I can't remember which one was that. She was a secretary, and that was really good. You know, she was being the efficient secretary, and it was really. You think that's pretty good, and that's nothing like what she was like in later roles. So
yes.
She was good.
It's a really, really, I mean, I think the question of her image is really very interesting, especially as it kind of coincided with the decline of the studio system. Because on the one hand, she was she did construct herself as well. And in my essay, in After Images, I start off by saying the two most iconic figures in the whole of Hollywood cinema could both walk around the streets in everyday life without being recognized. And one is associated with the rise of the cinema, which is Charlie Chaplin, and the other with the decline of the studio system, which is Marilyn Monroe. And both of them completely constructed their outward image. And Marilyn worked very closely with her makeup man, Whitey Snyder, to create the image that we think of as the Marilyn image. And both Charlie Chaplin and Marilyn Monroe can both be evoked with a couple of little pencil strokes. If you see what I mean. And sorry, I'm getting completely distracted here. Quite wrong. They had rather similar backgrounds. They both were brought up by single mothers who both suffered from very, very bad depression and mental problems. They were both put into foster homes. And in some sense, this kind of performance, the emphasis on performance and perfection kind of took them out of that. And I sometimes think, just to go back to my earlier point, and then we should stop talking about Marilyn, because I know Bradley's got some other questions. Yeah. It seems to me that when Marilyn, as I said earlier, starts to act the ordinary American woman who wants to look like Marilyn Monroe, she's actually going back to being Norma Jean and rediscovering that the vulnerability that she had before she became the iconic figure of the early 50s. Anyway.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So I'll move on to the next one. So it strikes me that there's an interesting overlap between your essays on melodrama and your own film, Riddles of the Sphinx. In your essay on Douglas Sirk and in your essays on Douglas Sirk and Rainer Werner Fassbinder, you explore how these two directors used melodrama in order to create social critiques. Riddles of the Sphinx, at one level, is also a melodrama deployed as social critique. And on the other hand, it also uses the essay format to structure the film. The film itself could be seen as an essay or melodrama. So what interests me here is that we get the kind of melodrama as social critique on the one hand, and we get essay as a kind of aesthetic device on the other. To what extent do you see this film as challenging our understanding of these two words, on the one hand, melodrama, and the other hand, essay?
Well, that's a kind of overcomplicated question, Bradley.
Yes. It's always two questions rolled into one.
Amalgamated, as we said on the phone this morning, you've amalgamated the melodrama and the essay, and I see perfectly well why you've done this. But I think I'll probably try and separate them out a bit.
Yes, certainly, yeah.
But I really liked the way that you associated riddles and melodrama and the late movies of Douglas Sirk and also the Fassbinder ones as well. Here I think, if I can just kind of step back a bit, that from an aesthetic point of view, if I can go back to melodrama first, the melodrama was the genre that was supposed to appeal to the older woman. It's set in domestic situations, generally about a mother with difficult relations with her children, the problem of the sexuality of the older woman, all the constraints that she has imposed on her. And this is, in a sense, embodied in the domestic environment itself. So essential for the melodrama in some ways, or for a certain kind of women's melodrama, is the confines of the domestic space. So you have the interiority of the house, the interiority of the house that contains the woman, the mother, but also then leads to the interiority of her own mind and her dreams, her aspirations, and what cannot be spoken. So it then leads on to a sense of the unspeakable, of how the desires and the problems of the woman in this domestic space are actually cannot actually be articulated. So there you have a silence, a question of silence, which I didn't think I talked about earlier. I meant to talk about it earlier. And so the aesthetic of the melodrama is associated with displacing meaning and emotion from ordinary transparent speech onto the language of cinema itself. So, for instance, in Thomas Alcesse's famous essay, Tales of Sound and Fury, on the Hollywood melodrama, he associates that inability to articulate with the way in which meanings are then transferred to lighting, camera movement, mise en scène, sound, and particularly music. So if you think of the kind of cliche way in which the Hollywood melodrama, at a moment of emotion, suddenly the full orchestral score kind of comes unconvincingly onto the soundtrack. And the way that the melodrama really is the mixture of drama and music. So that means that the melodrama, although perhaps the most despised of Hollywood genres, also demanded that the spectator deciphers. So what is not being what is not being said being transferred to the mise en scène? How does color and lighting and so on pick up on the feelings that are beyond speech? And I think there's something there in the central section of Riddles of the Sphinx, when we use the 360-degree pans, which again kind of transfer meaning and emotion and feeling out of what's said onto the actual mechanism, strategy of the film itself. So, and also color. So for those of you who's not seen Riddles of the Sphinx, it begins in a kitchen, and once again, possibly, I mean, even consciously mimicking the melodramas of Douglas Sirk and so on, moving in a 360-degree pan around the domestic space, and seeing that pan as evoking both the space of maternal comfort, but also the space of claustrophobia and confinement. So I think in that way, Bradley, I really kind of respond to your question. But I did pick out a quotation for this question as well. And this comes from the literary theorist Peter Brooks. And this is about gesture. So the way that gesture comes in when speech fails. He says, mute gesture is an expressionistic means, precisely the means of melodrama, to render meanings which are ineffable, but nonetheless operative in the sphere of human ethical relations. Gesture could perhaps then be typed as the nature of catachresis, catachresis being the figure used when there's no proper name for something, when something is unnamed. Yet, of course, it is the fullness, the pregnancy of the blank that's significant, meaningful, though unspeakable. So here, it's almost as it were like going back to the dwelling on process and process of perception that I started with. Here, there's no proper name for something meaningful, though unspeakable, and that is displaced onto the actual materiality of the film itself, whether it's mise en scène, whether it's lighting, whether it's color, whether it's camera movement. And in our case, it was really very concentrated on camera movement, but also kind of color and lighting and framing and so on. And also, I think it comes back to the whole question of whether emotion can be expressed or not. And I had another quotation from Yvonne Rayner, who called her film Lives of the Performers a melodrama. And she was making films about the same time as we were in the early 70s. And she was trying to find a new language. And this dwelling on what she calls a new lexicon. He says, having survived my various physical and psychic traumas and emboldened by the women's movement, I felt entitled to struggle with an entirely new lexicon, the language of specific emotional experience, promised all the ambivalent pleasures and terrors of the experiences themselves, seduction, passion, rage, betrayal, grief, joy. And all these, in a sense, both, as it were, summon up both the poetic, but also the displacement onto the materiality of the medium itself.
It's almost like, in the same way that you were taking these things from Freud, this new language and new ways of understanding things, that melodrama also, or that language of emotion from melodrama.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And again, I suppose you could take that back to the way in which the melodrama, cited as it is within the domestic space and the psyche of the older woman, to what extent it's relating to some kind of generalized unconscious. You could take it indeed back to that.
Yeah.
Could I ask if there was any explicit influence from Antonio Natto, who obviously wrote quite extensively about that idea that there are limits of where language fails and only gesture can really communicate like the heights of kind of experience?
I'm not sure there was consciously in that film. In a much later film, Crystal Gazing, we have a long quotation from Artaud, but it's in rather a different kind of context. But I wonder, this is the kind of theatre of cruelty, Artaud. I think we should have been more, I think we were probably more aware of Brecht than we were of Artaud. And that might have just been a cultural slip up of the time, if you see what I mean. Because Brecht was much more in the public eye than Artaud was. But Brecht was very interested in gesture as well. And the theatre of the time definitely was.
No, I suppose, well, I was just going to bring it to the other side of the question, that there's also that element of the essay coming in as a sort of structuring and aesthetic device as well.
We didn't think of it at the time as an essay film because I think that's a concept that's emerged more, well, actually it did emerge quite early, but it was really picked up in the 1990s when, in the way that cinema became more, that it became possible to make essay films more easily in the 1990s. But we thought of our films more as theory films or ideas films.
Yeah.
But they were indeed essayistic, but they were also trying to quite specifically engage with questions of language. or indeed the lack of language that's associated with, again, Johann, to come back to the question of the symbolic order and the exclusion, women's exclusion from the symbolic order. So there was a lot of interest, of our interest was to do with the relationship of language, how to analyze language, how to use language in different kinds of ways, but also how to acknowledge silences and how to break silences.
Do you think I could ask a question related to that? So I'm not sure, again, because I'm perhaps on shaky historical grounds here, but it does seem that there's been something like an eruption of the dimension of the real into the way we think today. No doubt thanks to, you know, the Slovenian theorists who emphasize the real above the other two registers. So I was toying with the idea just now. If you know, if the 60s and 70s were a period of, you know, concern with representation, with signifiers and so on, could we say that now we've moved into the age of the real instead? And what would an ethics of cinema look like in relation to this? And it's vague because of my own, you know, lack of specific understanding here. So
no, I think you've made a really to the point. I mean, I think that in the 70s, with the avant-garde movement that we were involved with, we were particularly engaged with questions of signification and the gap between the signifier and the signified, and trying to open up that space for a kind of materiality of communication that I was trying to think about earlier. Sorry, but I think there was also a consciousness of the intractability, that the real was the ultimate intractable, that couldn't be conveyed. But I think although that was the point that Lacan dwelt on, obviously the register in which the real cannot be conveyed shifts. So the ineffableness of the real at one moment can indeed become the effableness of the real in another moment, in which something else then might become the ineffable. And I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about the Lacanian concept of the real, which isn't something that I've dwelt on as much as I would have liked to. But it seemed to me very much that when we moved, this might actually take us into your next question, your final question, actually.
All right.
About
well, we can go out of order if that helps.
Yeah. Which is the actual what happens to the theorist, the feminist theorist, the avant-garde filmmaker theorist, when they're actually confronted with shifts in society which actually take them beyond their own theoretical understanding.
Yeah.
So this is the point. I think perhaps, Bradley, could you actually read out your final question?
Yeah, so in the introduction to the second edition of The Visual and Other Pleasures, you write, looking back from the late 1980s, it seemed as though deeply important changes were engulfing society, while I was looking elsewhere at cinema and at the unconscious. So today also seems to be going through important changes, how do you feel we should be thinking about these broader changes both then and now?
Mm. Well, it was very difficult. There'd been in a sense, a utopian spirit of this avant-gardist 1970s. And it might seem completely absurd, but there were ways in which that we felt at the time that by challenging representation, challenging images, challenging language, challenging cinema, it might be possible to shift the way in which the ideology of society functioned. So, in a sense, to move after, post 79 into full-blown Thatcherism was exactly like that, feeling as though we'd been looking somewhere else, and that these political and economic catastrophes had kind of crept up on us when we weren't looking. So I thought of it at the time as, do you know the Tennyson poem, The Lady of Shalott? Anyone?
I've read it a long time ago. I wouldn't remember any of the lines, but yeah, I've read it.
Well, in the story, the Lady of Shalott has been condemned to only look at the world reflected in a mirror.
Mm.
And she can only see what she sees in the mirror. And then when Sir Lancelot rides past, she sees him in the mirror, and she is entranced and turns round, and then the mirror cracks and her whole world falls apart and she dies. So anyway, this again might seem a little bit pretentious, but I felt that these questions of representation, which had been so important to us, hadn't given us any, hadn't educated us to think about the actual social and political crises that were taking place in society. Now, I also think this cuts both ways, because in a sense, at the same time as Thatcherism was really bringing the most appalling post-industrial catastrophe to our working class communities, at the same time, universities and the curriculum were actually changing, so that cultural studies came onto the curriculum, women's studies came onto the curriculum, queer studies came into the spectrum. I don't think questions of race were just beginning to come onto the curriculum. So in some ways, there was an important shift within the academic world, which I think paradoxically has probably had a real impact on how people are thinking now. So I don't know quite how to express this properly. There's a kind of out of syncness. We were out of sync with the 80s, but I think perhaps that the ideas that emerged academically have now spread much more widely in society and are now affecting the way in which people think in their everyday consciousness. So I don't think that it's worth saying that emphasis on ideas and that move into the academia, which I saw at the time, although it actually affected me because I'd never been an academic before. And when I left university as a kind of disaster area, I would never dreamt in the whole world that I had an academic future. But I do think that there is a sense in which people's everyday thinking has been affected by the kinds of innovations that took place in academia in the 1980s and the 90s. I don't know what the rest of you think. I mean, you're all so much younger than me. Max, what do you think?
I don't know. I kind of instinctively, I kind of want to say, and I'm falling back on tried and trusted concepts here, but it just seems very dialectical to me that the historical kind of reality of mainstream politics sort of does, to use that term you said, you used, fall out of sync with perhaps the progressive aspects of, that are kind of rearing their heads in academic institutes and in artistic scenes and this sort of thing, and the two seem to just war indefinitely, and sometimes it doesn't always seem like it's a movement forward. But yeah, I don't know, that term sprung to mind listening to what you were saying there. That being said, I'm quite disillusioned with really the modern state of academia. I think it's it becomes so corporatized. It's pretty scary now.
Absolutely true. Mark, were you here to come in there?
No, I was just going to agree that academia now is very much in line with the current state of government.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, it does seem to be more to do with like factory line sort of producing people ready for a career at the end rather than anything.
Is that liberal or is it accidental? I don't know.
No, yeah, that's a good question.
I think it's just it's just been a gradual erosion over the years, hasn't it? So,
yes, but you see, I was at university 60 to 63, where in those days there wasn't any sense that you were at university for a career. You were at university to have your mind, have your mind tuned up and expanded, and your horizons broadened, and so on. And I think it's much more instrumental nowadays.
I think it definitely is. I mean, there are lots of modules on courses which are specifically geared towards work skills and like kind of administrative tasks and stuff, which seems like that would never be the case in the 60s or 70s. Maybe I'm idealizing it. I wasn't alive.
No, you're not. No, that was the case. But it didn't get us anywhere much.
So in your work on Frida Kahlo and Tina Medotti,
oh yes, I haven't thought
explore the relationship between the avant-garde art, political revolution, and the personal lives of these two artists. So you say the personal is political recasts Kahlo's private world in a new light, and that Medotti's work as a photographer can be understood in the context of her private life and position as a woman. So to what extent can the idea that the personal is political, and I think also that the political is personal, help us understand the connection between radical politics and the aesthetic avant-garde?
Goodness, he does have questions, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And, I mean, the Medotti-Kahlo conjuncture, if I could give some background, I don't know if any of you would be interested. I mean, it was really a chance thing that we went to Mexico for a holiday. I think it was Christmas, New Year, 1978. And it might seem hard for you to believe this, but in those days, we'd never heard of Frida Kahlo when we went there. And never heard of Tina Medotti, but that's probably not so surprising. And so Peter particularly, who'd been very involved with bringing the Soviet avant-garde back into visibility, was absolutely fascinated by the Mexican avant-garde and how different it was, and its particular relationship to colonialism and recovery of the pre-colonial roots, which Frida Kahlo seemed to represent. but also at the same time, the interest in an international socialist politics, which Tina Medotti seemed to represent. So it was a kind of rather fortuitous, interesting conjuncture between these two women. And also an interest, because if I can kind of come back more to Bradley's question, that Frida Kahlo's retreat, as it were, into herself took her into, as we put it, her roots. So she investigated her own sense of the pre-colonial Mexican heritage. And this was, as it were, through her engagement with her own body. Tina Medotti, on the other hand, moved away. I mean, what extent, wait a minute, where have we got this? Medotti's work as a photographer, the context of her private life and position as a woman, that was her rejection of her status as beauty and model for Edward Weston. And so when she started to take photographs herself, she rigorously photographed the socialist movement in Mexico and also women and their lives. So in a sense, I suppose we were saying that Tina looked out into the outside world as she rejected being the object of the male gaze, if you can forgive me for putting it so crudely. Whereas Frida explored through her own body, her own roots in the pre-colonial Mexico. So it's a kind of ambivalence in the two, in which in both cases the female body is of the essence, but in both cases it leads to a political gaze and a political investigation of the culture that they were interested in, or something, Bradley.
Yeah. Well, I suppose they both have a sort of revolutionary potential, but in a very different way. Is that be or
definitely. I mean, I think the part of the problem is that the Frida Kahlo, who I still think is an extremely interesting artist, has just been reduced to cliche. So, I mean, what does one think when one sees Theresa May wearing a Frida Kahlo cliche bracelet as she gives her address to the Conservative Party conference? So there's a way in which, I mean, this might come back to Clara's point about Marilyn, in the sense that Marilyn has become a cliche. She too has become an image that you can buy on a handbag or a bracelet. She's been the actual kind of huge interest that's there in her image and her presence has been demeaned, as it were.
Well, it's like a brand. It's become a brand.
It's become brands, just as Frida Kahlo has become a brand. So, I mean, I think it shows, I mean, this might go back to Iona. Is Iona still with us?
Yeah.
It might go back to the way in which the commodification of the female image is almost a kind of intractable. The way that capitalism regains and owns the image of woman and turns it into a cliche so easily. And the brand, as it were, dominates.
Sort of reduces it to the mode of production, to multiple images and the profit that goes with that.
Yes.
Sort of crudifies it.
And so, I mean, in the sense that seeing that, as it were, the relationship between the woman and commodity fetishism that I was talking about earlier in capitalist society, in a sense, these particular really, really interesting women are kind of recuperated as celebrity cult, as it were.
And do you think the commodity fetishism, because I mean, there's so many products aimed at women with the makeup,
Yes.
is it more in the realm of women, do you think, or in a certain way? Or
Sorry, will you say that again?
Oh, just this thing that you're just making me think, saying these things about commodity fetishism. Do you think that's because there's so many products sort of for women, makeup and fashion?
Yes.
And sort of fashion changes all the time for women.
Yeah.
I don't think it does in the same way for men. And do you think it's more geared towards women, the sort of women as buyers and women sort of as, I don't know, sort of...
Yes, absolutely. And so, in a sense, when capitalism kind of rediscovered itself as marketing, as commodities, women then became the other end of the discourse of commodity fetishism. And it was all then to do with how to fetishize yourself and your own image through the fetishization of the commodity. So whether it was to do, I mean, if you go back, say, to the 1950s launch of the domestic commodity, it was all to do with, as it were, the status of your kitchen, and then indeed the status of your appearance. It was all to do with consumption. But the two things went together, the commodification of the woman as image and the commodification of the capitalist mode of production.
Tickwen's The Theory of the Young Girl. It's like a collectively written, very weird kind of manifesto.
What's that? I didn't know that.
It's published by Semiotext, but they develop a kind of...
Really?
They use the young girl as a kind of description of a sort of generalized consumer, so that they're kind of treating the young girl as all of us in some ways. But this idea that consumerism becomes associated with young and girl, those two words.
Yes. I mean, I went through a phase of being really fascinated by the young modern woman of the 1920s, and especially in different kinds of movies across the world, but perhaps very particularly in Hollywood. But there was a kind of ambivalence. Max said something earlier that I'm trying to grasp, but I can't get it quite. I mean, in a sense, the young modern woman was an image of liberation, and she had a job. She had a certain determination over her own sexuality. Her image changed, and she became much more gamine, more androgynous, much freer. But at the same time, if you think of the way in which the movies were addressing the young modern woman in the 1920s, it was also very much addressing a whiteness, because at the same time, it was a way in which African American culture was beginning to come onto the scene, and really making real inroads into the popular culture of the time. And there's a way in which Hollywood was incapable of taking this on. I think I'll just have to say this last thing, and then I've probably got to disappear.
Yeah, that's fine.
So it's just a question which has always struck me about the racism of Hollywood cinema, that it was actually an apartheid cinema and couldn't actually contain African American performance, that in a sense, you come up against a difference between sound and image. The African American culture could make much further inroads in music and in sound, where it was completely taboo in image and on the screen. And this isn't something that I really understand, but it just seems to be extremely striking, and makes one think about what in the human mind and the human sensibility is so particular about the visual, that taboos appear so readily in the visual that are more manipulable or more manageable or more acceptable in other kinds of sensibilities, senses and sensibilities. If I could end with a little bit of sense and sensibility. Yeah. But I think it was very striking, for instance, that if you go back to the coming of synchronized sound in the late 1920s in Hollywood, it was a period when African American culture had really taken off, was there on Broadway, it was there on the radio, it was there in record culture, it was there in performance, and you would have expected that Hollywood would have just embraced it, jumped on it, and used this kind of this extraordinary renaissance. But in fact, it was completely taboo.
Well, they have a sort of Disney-fied, a sort of Uncle Tom type version of it. Of the
yes, but so minimal. So minimal, and so there are just a couple of Hollywood movies which do showcase some of the talent, but you have to look at them not as movies, but you just have to look at them as something like a vaudeville show where individual brilliant performers actually show off what they can do, while the actual framework is some very demeaning and quite racist story.
I guess they're not given the sort of narrative agency, the black characters. They're there in service. The narrative will revolve around the white character with them.
Well, the films that I'm thinking of actually were all black.
Stormy Weather, I'm thinking when you... That was
because the best films, the most interesting films with black performers were all black casts and have no white figures in them.
Yeah.
From Cabin in the Sky to Carmen Jones.
Yeah.
You've seen?
Yeah.
Seen
Preminger, is it?
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Who said Preminger?
I did, yeah.
Oh, well done. Yeah.
Paul Robeson was good in Showboat.
In the first Showboat, that's absolutely true. I think Showboat is a really interesting film, Iona.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the few ones that really touches on and even the second Showboat, I think, is quite interesting. Yeah, no, that's quite true. And I think Showboat is actually really about racism. Even if you could say in some ways you can't get away from racism within it, but it is trying to be about it. In the same way that I don't know if anyone has seen Douglas Sirk's.
It's like that. I was just thinking of Douglas Sirk.
Imitation of
yeah, like that. Yeah, similar. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, that's a very moving one.
Yeah.
Well, I've lasted much longer than I thought I was.
Done really well. Thank you so much for doing this.
And thank you so much, all of you, for joining in and being so interesting.
Thank you so much.
Nice to see you, Laura.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Well, perhaps we'll all meet another time.
That would be wonderful. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right then. Bye for
Well,
now.
bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bradley.
Thank you, Bradley. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Bradley.
Nice to meet
Very
you.
much.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our stuff, please visit www.explodingappendix.com. Exploding Appendix, ideas and culture with guts. Since you gotta go, oh, you'd better go now. Go now, go now, before you see me cry. I don't want you to tell me just what you intend to do now. 'Cause how many times do I have to tell you, darling, darling, I'm still in love with you now. Whoa. We've already said so long. I don't want to see you go. Oh, you better go now. Go now. Go now. Don't you even try telling me that you really don't want to end this way. 'Cause darling, darling, can't you see I want you to stay? Whoa. Since you gotta go, oh, you better go now. Go now, go now, before you see me cry. I don't want you to tell me just what you intend to do now. 'Cause how many times do I have to tell you, darling, darling, I'm still in love with you now. Whoa.